This is Educators Respond. This video and audio podcast series is dedicated to supporting educators as they respond to the COVID-19 crisis. The goal is to create conversation around how to effectively support the physical as well as social and emotional well-being of all members of school communities in Pennsylvania and beyond. Today I'm talking with Dr. Christopher Willard. And Dr. Willard is a psychologist and educational consultant, as well as a faculty member at Harvard Medical School. He serves on the board of directors at the Institute of Meditation and Psychotherapy and is the president of the Mindfulness and Education Network. He's also author of Child's Mind, Growing Up Mindful, and Raising Resilience, as well as 8 other books for parents, professionals, and children related to cultivating resilience and mindfulness. And he's also the father of 2 adorable children. I talk with Dr. Willard about how schools can promote post-traumatic growth and generally support members of school communities, especially should we return to some form of in-person instruction in the fall. We talk about the different ways teachers can connect with their students and make room for all the different ways everyone is coping and responding to what they are currently experiencing. Having worked with Chris as volunteers together at the Insight Meditation Society's teen retreat, and having followed his career as an advocate for mindfulness and education and as a skilled therapist, I was really excited to get his thoughts on this situation and talk together about what we can do to take the mental health of our students and our teachers seriously. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining me and talking with me today. I am so pumped for this conversation and in talking with you in the last couple of days and kind of reconnecting and discussing what you're doing in your work and what you're thinking about these days was just honestly, it's been rejuvenating to me. So I'm really excited to kind of have that conversation on the podcast.
And I'm so excited to be here too. And you know, we've had these interesting conversations. I hope we can recreate them really well in this podcast today. So we'll see how we do. But I know it's always just such a pleasure to talk to you and throw ideas around and think about how we can make the world better, help these kids, help educators. Yeah, absolutely. I just so appreciate what you're doing with this podcast and all your other work.
Well, and it feels like this summer is critical. This is going to be such a transformational time, and anything that we can do to offer support, offer help, kind of consider and conceptualize what this new reality is going to look like seems really valuable. And I know that that's been kind of your work for a long time. And I thought maybe I could start with how we met each other and how we started working together.
Yeah.
And so we both volunteer with the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, with their annual teen retreat in the summers. And for people who don't know, this is kind of an amazing thing. Every summer, these 14 to 19-year-olds come out to kind of rural Massachusetts and spend 4 or 5 days largely in silence for like 4 or 5 hours of the day. They're practicing seated meditation, they're practicing walking meditation, yoga, and metta or loving kindness meditation. And then as volunteers, we get to share that space and help build that container, and then also participate in conversations with them about what they're making sense of in their practice. And I don't know about you, but for me, that was an absolutely transformational experience to be at IMS and to work with teens in that capacity.
Oh my gosh, it's such an incredible time. And as someone who goes on, well, not so much since I had kids, as someone who used to go on a lot of retreats before I had my own kids, I would say also like it was one of the most challenging, eye-opening, provocative retreats for me. Just, you know, being a staff on a retreat, I felt like I came out of it with far more self-awareness even than other meditation or mindfulness retreats I've been on. And I think that's just a really interesting thing, you know, to go through in that process. And it made me realize something as an educator too, which is how much as educators we're always getting our buttons pushed all the time. And I would feel like the unpopular counselor and realizing I was like, oh, but that's just like what all these kids are feeling because they're all like living in high school and this is bringing me back to high school and all these ways of like, am I cool enough? Am I well liked? And like just all that stuff and watching that unfold in real time in a meditative, contemplative context being just so much growth for me as a person, as well as just this incredible experience of watching these kids grow and their insights and watching my peers and meeting amazing people like you and other folks. It's a cool thing. Yeah.
You know, as a researcher, I always am looking for evidence. right? To kind of
Mm,
support what other practices we should be doing. And over the, I don't know, 13 years of watching that retreat and working with teens in that capacity, like it was, maybe it's anecdotal, but it was a lot of anecdotes. It was every single year watching these transformations take place
yeah,
and young people not being told what to think, but having the time to sit with themselves and sit with their peers and make sense of their world in
right.
these powerful transformational ways. That to me was the convincing point where I realized there's something really here that could be valuable if it could be brought into or brought towards the school setting.
Right, right, absolutely. And I mean, the same is true. I work as a therapist these days. It's the same thing. It's not me telling someone what to do. It's helping them discover for themselves what is true and creating that space in which we facilitate that happening, that self-discovery and that discovery, and provoking that curiosity. Like these days when you and I talk about mindfulness, and one of the ways I think about mindfulness more and more these days is curiosity is almost another definition of mindfulness. Like, can we get curious about our experience and get curious about the world? It's not, it's an element of mindfulness. It's not the definition really, but it's such an important one. And I think that whether it's contemplative practice, education, psychotherapy, growth and development, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that because I want to come back to how mindfulness could be incorporated in our response to this current crisis, and within school settings, how that might be one of the tools that'd be useful. But before we go there, I wanted to say, so you kind of blew my mind. And we were talking on the phone, and you were talking about your current line of research and working with the concept of post-traumatic growth as opposed to post-traumatic stress, this idea that there could be growth out of that. Now, I'm familiar with resiliency. I'm familiar with kind of grit research and other kind of ways that we conceptualize responding to challenge, responding to high levels of stress. But this idea of somehow of post-traumatic growth really shook me and stayed with me. Like, what are the conditions for that? So maybe could you tell me a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, and it's certainly become, I think for good reason, it's become a bit of a trend in psychotherapy and education. I think, looking at things now through a trauma lens has really been eye-opening, I think, for a lot of educators. And yet at the same time, what's interesting to me is that the norm after a traumatic experience is actually post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress. And that's clinically true, but I think it's also interesting just to look kind of historically, anthropologically, spiritually at what are the things that humans have been through over time, which is all kinds of horrible things, and came out of it stronger as individuals, stronger as communities, stronger as cultures and subcultures to reinvest in what a culture and individuals' values really are, to rediscover those, to find new ways of discovering our own strengths. And I think right now, we can talk about this pandemic situation in terms of trauma, which again is a big word, but I think fits in a lot of situations. A lot of people are in really traumatic situations right now, and will be throughout this. But I think also looking toward, well, how do we cultivate post-traumatic growth? More wisdom out the other side, more strength out the other side, more community out the other side, right? How do we really, less isolation, right? Like, how can we really find the causes and conditions under which we get more of that than depression, anxiety, addiction, right? All these other, things that grow out of ACEs, right? Adverse childhood events, which we, thankfully are hearing more and more about these days as well. But how can we be more resilient out the other side of this? How can our kids be more resilient out the other side of this?
And our whole school systems, right? I
Right.
mean, it would be a
Right.
shame in some ways if after all of this, we go back to the way
Yeah,
we've always done things. Because some of
exactly.
the aspects of how we were always doing things weren't good,
Right.
including our lack of knowledge about trauma and adverse childhood experiences and the impact that has on schooling situation.
And I do think, I mean, hopefully this can be, a crisis that begets opportunity and growth, and not one that begets, more division or more like, let's just all go back to how it was, but can really start to lead to some more creative thinking about how we can rebuild and support everyone in really new and different ways. And I think, you know, what I see when I talk to educators around the country and really around the world isn't, you know, some places want to go back to how it was, but other people are really thinking hard about how to go back. You know, a lot of places, including where I live, are like, you know, first up are the kids who've been underserved. You know, that's who needs to get testing. That's who needs to get interventions earlier on. That's who need, you know, the special education kids in my community, thankfully, are really getting the attention before actually a lot of the other kids are. And I think that is so important, and getting mental health support out to folks, getting, you know, even just sort of our basic needs met, in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, so many districts are doing amazing work trying to get kids fed, trying to make sure kids are in safe environments, getting them into shelters if they're in abusive situations, right? I think this is incredible. And other places we're seeing like, let's just go back to normal. Let's just try to do what we did, but online, which of course we know doesn't really work. Right. You know, not to mention, you know, how many kids are not able to access broadband and things like that. And I mean, it's just, yeah. So hopefully we can learn from what's working, learn from science, both in terms of how to treat this disease and how to treat, you know, the effects that it's had on all of our communities, and especially our school communities and our kids.
So can you walk me through this idea of post-traumatic growth, and what are the conditions that lead to growth as opposed to other kinds of negative outcomes? Like, are there things that we know about how to create the conditions that better support growth in that experience?
There are some, and I think, again, it's interesting. It's instructive to look to psychology, but I think it's also really instructive to look to history and anthropology, to look to spiritual practices that, again, are things humans have had for a very long time that have helped them through challenging, traumatic, disruptive situations. And I think, I mean, I tend to think of mental health and mental illness being built around like a biopsychosocial model. How can we thrive in our bodies? What can we do? How can we thrive mentally in terms of our cognition, in terms of our psychological outlook on things? How can we thrive in terms of our relationships, in terms of our social lives? So building strong communities, I think, is also really important. All of these are things that we can do. One of the reasons post-traumatic stress develops in people who have been through traumatic situations is there's a few conditions that have to be met. One is feelings of helplessness and a lack of control, and kind of the randomness of it. This is why you see after, you know, if you look at veterans or something like that, it's like, it's not necessarily the battles themselves, right? It's the randomness. It's the being in the trenches in World War I for 3 days, then there's suddenly a barrage of artillery fire, but you don't know when it's coming from. It's walking through the jungle in Vietnam. You go on the same patrol every night for 5 weeks. It's fine. Then you walk over a tripwire and something happens to your buddy. It's this kind of hurry up and wait randomness that's part of what creates, and that's that feeling of helplessness and lack of control, right? So I think some of the things that we can do to disrupt that is, like, we all know that we don't know what the world is going to look like in 6 months or 6 years, even 6 weeks, right? So it's unpredictable. But what we can do is we can try to make things predictable for ourselves, for our students, for our families. So I don't know what to tell my own son about what's going to happen with school next year, but I can tell him what today is going to look like. And that actually helps him to feel safe and contained. And as teachers, I think, educators, I think, doing as much previewing as we can with what we do know. Here's what we're going to do today. Here's what we're going to do till the end of the school year, right? What each day is going to look like. Having rhythms and routines and touch points, rituals, things like that. This really helps us to all feel safe and contained when we don't know what's coming after that, right? So that really helps for one thing. Controlling what we can. And then in terms of feeling helpless, like learning how to, right? Mr. Rogers, or Mr. Rogers' mother, actually, who of course doesn't get the credit for it, Mr. Rogers gets the credit, right? There's that quote where he says, when I was little, terrible things would happen. My mom would say, look for the helpers, right? So talking to our kids about who the helpers are, and talking to our kids about becoming helpers, right? So if you look at resilience research, you see a few things about kids that have overcome these adverse childhood events that they've faced at different points in their lives. One is that they had that quote unquote charismatic adult in their life, one person who is consistently there. And guess what? That's often us, educators, therapists, parents, right? We're that person in a child's life who's consistent, predictable, right? Again, back to that lack of control, predictability thing. They also often, if you ask those kids to describe important memories, meaningful memories from their childhood, they'll often in the qualitative research say they were given responsibility, they were asked to do something to contribute. So what I don't want the takeaway from that to be is parents saying, all right, do the dishes, right? That's not what I mean. Although if you can get your kid to do the dishes, like, God bless you, right? Please come to my house, get my son to do the dishes. But really what I mean is kids love to help with something bigger than them, and so do we adults. Can our kids sew masks? Can our kids make beautiful artwork and send it to the retirement community down the street who can't get visitors right now? Can our kids make signs and put them up in the windows thanking the first responders and frontline workers, right? When we're helpers, we feel less helpless because we feel like we're doing something. And so many of us feel so helpless right now, and our kids feel so helpless. Can we as educators get the college kids who are home with nothing to do, the high school seniors who are sitting around, can we get them to maybe tutor the sixth graders who are falling behind and give them one-on-one math support or writing support or reading support? And then they're feeling that those kids are then doing something meaningful and helpful, contributing. And those other kids who are falling behind are getting maybe a charismatic, consistent adult in their life. Oh my gosh, resilience on both ends, right? How can we get creative about this? And then all of this is ways to build a stronger community. Do a community project as a school that's making thank you notes to send to people. So I think these are some of the ways that we can create post-traumatic growth and resilience, right? In ourselves as individuals and in our communities at large. And I think just trying to get creative about how we do this, which, we can start to really dig down and think about what are the community projects where we can be the helpers and we can facilitate that in our communities as well.
I hear a lot in that. And one is, sometimes the story of school can be, it's our job to open up heads and pour knowledge into heads. Mm-hmm. And that's what school is, right? Right. But project-based learning has always been a thread that ran through. Student-centered learning has always been a thread that ran through. But this idea of social project learning for students to kind of engage them in activities that are helpful to a community that really needs more helpers. Right. There's not a community in the country right now that doesn't need more help, tragically, or in the world, really.
Right.
And so what is an aspect, what is a project that can be picked up, and the energy of knowing that you're helping can be fuel for learning, but it also can be, to your point, that this support for their own resiliency, the sense that they are helping, that they are impacting this in a positive way.
Whatever this looks like, it's strengthening those threads of the community that I think we can all agree have really gotten frayed over the past few years and decades. And what a time to really start to tighten and strengthen those threads and fabric, I think. This is an incredible opportunity to do that if we can take advantage of that.
So one aspect I'm hearing then is we can engage students in kind of social projects, like group projects that are aiding the community, right? And that has impacts for resilience. It has impacts for a sense of control of their own life. And it creates those kind of relationships that they're going to be working together towards a common purpose that's real, right? That isn't an academic purpose, but is using academic subjects to accomplish something real in the world. But another thing I heard in what you were saying was this idea of kind of narratives, or kind of how do I make sense of what's happening, right? So going back to the soldier who's kind of walking through the same jungle every day and nothing happens, that the narrative is nothing happens until the day something happens, and then that disrupts that whole story. Right. And for all of us, our story of what's normal has been disrupted. Right. And for young children especially, and especially children whose story has been previously disrupted, they've experienced trauma at other times in their lives. Making sense and making a narrative of their own lives and their own experience and what's going to be happening in the future, right? They're grasping for that. Do you think there are ways that we could help children to make sense of that, or what are the ways that schools can participate in helping them build cohesive narratives?
I mean, I do think it's really important that schools find a way to help kids build cohesive personal narratives. And I think also that then to build cohesive community narratives, because one of the things also that certainly I see happening, and that is also just historically predictable in a pandemic situation, is people are under stress. When you're under stress, what happens to our brain? Well, it shuts off its critical thinking abilities. And so we see things in black and white terms. And then what we see is we see a lot more xenophobia, blaming, conspiracy kind of thinking, right? And these are really dangerous narratives. So because they end up truly doing harm to individuals, to groups of people, and to the fabric of society when people start falling prey to these kinds of ideas. So I do think it's really important that we help people make individual sense of this by talking about, in safe ways, right? Talking about what was your experience of the pandemic? What stories are you telling? What art are you making? Right? As well as making sense scientifically. Can we, get back to teaching statistics? Can we get back to teaching, a little bit more science in a way that feels relevant to kids in our schools? I mean, my hope also is that at the other side of this, like, we're going to see a huge influx of people wanting to go into medicine, wanting to go into epidemiology, wanting to go into statistics, wanting to go into understanding disease and roots of disease, but I think also there are many ways to reach different kids in the ways that they will make sense of it. And I think it's really important that we do that before someone else, or some other group that's maybe does not have our kids' best interest in heart finds a way that's a simplistic way of making meaning out of this, that's blaming, or that's conspiratorial, or that is not grounded in good science and good critical thinking. So this is something I actually worry about. But I think finding ways, again, that are developmentally appropriate and match each kid are actually going to be important. And I think keeping kids busy, I think with doing good works, again, I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish, but I think that can actually be potentially an incredible thing for our communities and our larger global community as well.
So part of my mind, I hear certain teachers from my own teaching history, I hear their voices. Some of them are inherent caregivers in the sense that they've always been touching base with every one of their students, saying, how are things going for you? Like, what's going on at home? Hey, how did that baseball game go? Going to the baseball game. And they are amazing teachers, absolutely. And in a situation like this, that part of their identity as a caregiver comes forward.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it kind of guides how they're already considering, how can I reach out to my students? How can I connect with the students? That's what they're doing right now in this online reality, right? Reaching out and just touching base and being willing to say, are you okay? Is
Mm-hmm.
very comfortable for them. But on the other side, I hear my teacher friends who are gifted at teaching their subjects, and they are brilliant at delivering curriculum. And some of them are saying, yeah, but that's still my job, right? And I have students who are preparing for an AP exam, and I have students who are, who that's what they want to do. They, and I am, that's my primary purpose, right?
Yeah.
Is to teach the academic subject that I teach, especially at the high school level. I think that occurs more than elementary school teachers. But I'm kind of curious, are there ways that kind of a teacher can form the kinds of relationships that you're pointing to, that kind of caring adult, without having to shift their approach to how they relate to kids?
Yeah, and I think, and you and I started talking about this last week. I mean, I think one of the things that drives me crazy about any online debate is that it sort of puts things, it sets up a lot of false dichotomies, that it's curriculum versus connection. And it's like, these are not in opposition to each other. These are both possible. At the same time, everyone's going to have a strength that's a little bit more toward one side or the other of the spectrum. And that's okay, I think, for folks to continue leading with their strengths, but also continuing to learn how to grow toward, whatever their areas of not necessarily strengths might be as educators. And I do think that the other thing to remember is, for those of us like myself who are in the kind of like touchy-feely therapist role, some kids feel more contained by not spending half of class talking about their feelings or their emotions or what happened, because it's pretty unraveling for that kid. That doesn't feel safe at all for that kid. So I think also remembering that, we want to check in with our kids, but not forcing them to kind of check in with us. We want them to know that we're holding that space for them to enter, that it's invitational, but that they don't have to spend math class talking about how hard this has been for them, because that kid might get more unglued by that. So I think that's also really important for us to remember, especially when it comes to trauma. This has been interesting in a group that I've been working with a little bit, called the Emotional PPE Project, which is giving free therapy to doctors, nurses, and PAs and frontline workers. And it's been an interesting organization. And yet there hasn't been that much usage from a lot of the people on the front lines. And I've been talking to people who I know who are in medicine, and they're like, well, we need to deal with this, but we have to compartmentalize right now. And I think remembering that for some kids, like, compartmentalizing is not a bad thing. It's not a great thing to do forever, but sometimes in the midst of a crisis, compartmentalizing is really useful to kind of tuck this stuff away. And some kids feel really contained by teachers who are a bit more on the curriculum-oriented side of things, because that feels really safe for them to just be focusing on math, to just be focusing on history in that moment, right? And so I think also just really trying to validate that every educator has their strengths, and every kid is going to respond differently. Some kids may not feel as comfortable with the connection-oriented teacher. Some kids may feel less comfortable with the curriculum-oriented teacher. My hope is that every educator can learn how to expand their repertoire and expand their kind of window of ability between curriculum and connection. And again, these don't have to be oppositional to each other. But also just to get creative around how to stay connected with the kids, remembering also that when it comes to the kind of curriculum orientation, that facts and figures and names and dates and all that stuff is really important. Most importantly, though, what we want to help our kids do is keep their brains in shape, to not forget how to learn, trying to keep that in mind, that we're trying to keep their muscles active is probably what's really important. And that can be somewhere between curriculum and connection. And then I think also trusting your community. And I think good leadership in a community knows that there are some teachers that are 100% connection and some teachers that are 100% curriculum, and that fun Spanish teacher who's going to play games with a kid for an hour for one Zoom call, that's going to be really great for some kids, and is going to help them feel settled enough for that one teacher who's trying to grind out their exact same lesson plan that they were doing last year at this time on Zoom for the next hour or half an hour on Zoom, and that everyone's going to default to their thing, and it'll just be kind of more extremes, but in some ways, hopefully that will all kind of come out in the wash is my hope anyway. And I think good leadership ensures that happens, that any student gets a little bit of like the feel good fun teacher who's all 99% connection, and the hardcore teacher who's 99% about curriculum, and gets a good balance of that is my hope, right? And then my hope also is that all of us as educators learn all these other skills right now too, between curriculum and connection. And again, I don't want to put those things in opposition, because they're both so important.
And I'm wondering, and you've said this, right, that they're not in opposition,
right?
And I'm wondering, like, if there's another word. So I mean, I have teacher friends who I think are caregivers first, and teacher friends that are curriculum first.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes them amazing teachers is they're both connecting.
Right.
They're both
Right.
they both put connections first.
Right.
One puts the connection first by kind of creating that emotional bond and being a space where the students can talk about their lives and in ways that aren't comfortable necessarily for other teachers. And then teachers who are curriculum first or subject first, they're mainly focused on the curriculum, but you feel that connection, and students feel that connection. And
right.
I remember when I was in high school, a friend of mine tragically lost his father. And one of the teachers who was most impactful in kind of reaching him and helping him in that time, in that traumatic experience, was a math teacher who sat down and did math with him. And I don't know if they ever talked about the loss that he had experienced, but it was just, here's an adult who cares.
Right.
who's with me, who's kind of side by side with me in this time.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that. And I think remembering that some kids connect first around the intellect and then they open up. And as you said, also that side by side thing, I think, which figuring out how to replicate that, is going to be its own challenge. But I think that, the face-to-face teaching is one thing. And then that side-to-side mentoring, gosh, I could go on and on about that. But like, I do feel like there's something in there, Kevin, I don't know what, but yes, absolutely. And kids are not going to feel safe enough until they feel like they're being taken seriously intellectually, or that's the kind of love language that they grew up with, or whatever, kind of shorthand we want to put it in, right? Of that's how you connect first, and then you can open up from there, right? But just like to know that there's another adult who's keeping them safe just by teaching them math, I think is actually just an amazing thing. And I love that story, that it doesn't have to always lead with, like have to lead in this sort of like therapist-y way necessarily, but that it still is incredibly therapeutic and equally therapeutic. It's just going to match or resonate with a different kid differently.
Wortman and Silver had a book chapter, I think it was, called Myths of Coping. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, that seems really valuable and relevant right now. And it lays out, what are some of the beliefs that we have about how people cope with stress or traumatic experience, and then how does that impact the way that we go about helping them? And so some of those myths of coping so they laid out 5 within the chapter. The first is distress is inevitable following a major loss. So this idea that if you experience trauma, you will experience distress. And so in this moment, the myth is that all people impacted by this are traumatically experiencing high levels of toxic stress right now. And that's a myth, right? That there's all kind of a
Right.
range of relationships to that. The
And
second
what we
is,
see
oh, sorry, yeah.
is that some kids and some adults who have had a trauma experience, or who are kind of more highly wired for anxiety, are totally in their zone right now. Like, this is where they want to be. Like, they're great. Like, they're watching everyone else freak out, and they're like, oh, this is kind of where I feel comfortable, is with this level. Like, I think that's also really interesting to note and remember here too. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off, but yeah.
No, that's fine. Maybe we should go through one at a time, because there's a lot to unpack
Sorry,
here.
yeah, sorry.
No, I think it's great. I really do. Because just this idea that if you asked a student, are you okay? And they said yes, that you can believe that at times, right? At other times that might be covering, but there might be time, there are students who the answer is honest, and we shouldn't make them feel as though their reaction is problematic. And that actually brings up to the second myth, which is failure to experience distress is pathological. So anyone who is not being impacted in a negative way, or experiencing this as a toxic stress experience, is somehow maladaptive, or is not taking it in, or not responding in some way.
Really dealing with it, or yeah.
And so then our job as educators or therapists would be to try to get them to really feel it, which could be really problematic.
Yeah, especially when someone's not ready, and we're trying to break their container in a way that's not safe, because they're going to become unglued or decompensated, as we might say in more clinical language, when they go home or in their next class later at some point. Yeah.
When you say the word container, for someone who's experiencing that kind of a stress, what do you mean by they develop a container?
I mean, I guess I tend to think of, maybe a kind of more sort of, like compartmentalizing. Like, we all compartmentalize to some degree for survival. When we experience something traumatic, we might really try to repress it, suppress it, put it away, right, to get through the day. And again, I think that, there's often this idea that, like, you shouldn't compartmentalize. And I think therapy has taught people in good ways, you shouldn't spend too much time compartmentalizing. But I think what ends up getting translated to a lot of people is you should never compartmentalize. And I think actually we need to do that. It's healthy until it's not healthy. It works until it doesn't work. It works to be skeptical about trusting people until you just choose to never trust anybody ever again. Then it doesn't really work, so you can't have good relationships, right? So it's figuring out how to have the right amount of a container, compartmentalizing, something like that. that's safe for everybody, that keeps you functioning, but also, doesn't end up, causing other distress down the road, or you're not keeping it down with anxiety, or you're not keeping it down with alcohol and drugs, or you're not keeping it down with violence or something like that, right? So I think that's the key here, is how do we help people compartmentalize, uncompartmentalize, and put it back away again when it's time to put it back away again. Because otherwise what you see is that post-traumatic cycle of everything kind of flaring out and then flaring back, right? And we don't want to have that in our classrooms, and we don't want people to experience that, because it's unpleasant, and it's a terrible experience for the person who's experiencing that as well. Yeah.
And not therapeutic. It doesn't help to open the box and re-experience the traumatic event, or traumatically experience the memory of the event, and then have to kind of put that box back together by yourself after that class is over.
Yeah, exactly. Part of working through trauma is learning how to take something out and learning how to put it back away again, is what I would do as a therapist, is teaching people how to do that.
To be able to go there and then return?
Yeah, exactly. And not have it be quite so activating and quite so overwhelming for people, to be able to visit it, right? But not have that big reaction to it internally or externally, and then be able to put it back away again. Yeah. Because we can't get rid of the traumatic experience, but we can start to have a different response to that traumatic experience, or that trigger, is what the ultimate goal is, I would say. Yeah.
The third of the myths was that it's important to psychologically work through a loss, right? That everyone needs to go through a process of therapy, or needs to go through a process of talking about it in order to process this in a healthy way. And I don't in any way want to discount the value of those conversations for schools, right? I think that does need to be a priority, that we create spaces for conversations about what this experience has been like, how people are making sense of it, what is their narrative of what this experience is, right? And then share those narratives in order to create adaptive and healthy communal narratives that we share. I don't want to devalue that, but the idea that the student who doesn't want to talk about it is somehow at more risk, or that's problematic, right? To your point of kind of, it's okay for them to say, I want to maintain the container right now. I don't want to open this up, even if it is traumatic for them.
Right. Absolutely. I think we too often pathologize someone who doesn't want to open up. And I think we just need to remember, like, they don't want to open up right now. Put a little bit of, what do you call it? Growth mindset on it. I don't want to open up ever, or I don't want to open up right now. Let's actually shift that language to growth from fixed mindset for ourselves and for the kids that we're working with. I want that kid to open up. I don't necessarily want them to open up right before math class, or right before their basketball game, or whatever it might be. Right. Yeah. So thinking about that and remembering that for ourselves as adults too, that it might not be the right time. Yeah.
And these last two myths, the first is distress will eventually subside, right? Eventually, for every person who's going through this, this will end. And I hear this a lot in grieving, when students experience a loss of, like, a parent or a loss in their family, this idea of, oh, this will get better. And that messaging can be really problematic, I think, when we say to children, this will get better, because it might not get better right away, it might not get better ever, or it may not go away ever. Right.
I think it's so important. This won't go away. Loss doesn't go away, right? Our relationship to it changes, or hopefully changes, but it doesn't go away.
And the last one is individuals will reach a state of resolution, right? That they will, this will end, and everybody will have a closure on this, and we'll all be able to kind of move forward with this no longer impacting us.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, this idea that there is closure to certain kinds of events. It's like, there's more closure, but there's not absolute, right? It's always I believe, it's always an ongoing process, right, of waxing and waning. And then maybe we do get over it for a certain part of our life, but then we go off to college, or we get married, or we have our own kids, or someone we love gets sick, and then it comes back out again, right? We're never fully over it forever, because we change, right? We're over it for the person that was how they were that day, but then we change, and contexts change, and being open and accepting of the fact that not only will the world change, but we'll also change, and our relationship to this may come back again in new ways. Again, I think it's really important to remember. It may not too. Yeah.
And contextualizing that in this crisis, it's very foreseeable that schools will open in the fall. They will have a chance to kind of build a new normal. There'll be new protocols, new ways of relating to each other. They'll have opportunities to speak to each other about what their experience was and help make sense of that. Schools will develop a cultural narrative in some ways. I mean, I'm generalizing
Yeah.
in some extreme ways, but that they'll come together to that. And then there will be an outbreak in that community.
Right. Yeah.
And then we will have to kind of shift the paradigm entirely for that community again.
Right.
And re-experience all of that. And I prepare. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how to kind of help educators, help students to make sense of that potentiality, that unknown?
I think the most important thing for educators or for adults to be doing is to let kids know that we're going to do our best to keep them safe. That's our number one job. And that, I think we don't want to lie to them and say we know what's going to happen when we don't. But we also don't want to say, we don't know what's happening, because that's really alarming for kids. In fact, it's interesting because we do as adults want to share what we're feeling and share our emotions. But the one place we want to be careful actually is with anxiety, which actually really is quite contagious between adults and kids. We want to kind of show perhaps a little bit more confidence that we might have actually is important place to fake it, even though I feel weird saying that as a therapist, right? But I think the one thing we can tell our kids is that we are going to do our very best to keep them safe. And I think hopefully we can mean that as well, that this is what we're doing. We're going to take another week off from school until we feel, sort of like that it's a safe building to go back into for adults who are vulnerable or for kids who are maybe more vulnerable. And I think saying that, and I think predicting what we can predict again, right? We don't know what's going to happen, but there might be another week or two off from school, right? We don't want to necessarily say we don't know what's going to happen, but probably someone in your community will die. Like that might be a lot to say to a kid, right? Depending on their age and their developmental maturity, and, saying there's a blanket statement, although it is the truth, right? So I think, and I think as adults though, preparing for those realities, like there may not even be an outbreak, but it might be, the superintendent's mother-in-law, gets this and gets sick and dies, or, something, like that could happen, right? I mean, I think for us to all be kind of aware of the ways this is impacting us adults as individuals is also really important. And that's maybe some of that we share with kids and maybe some of it we don't, depending on their maturity, depending on their age, depending on a bunch of other factors like their stability and their vulnerability. But I do think, I think just predicting what we can predict, and that, today is going to go like this. We're going to follow the routine, and the home routine when we go back to school online is going to be, we're still going to sing the song in the morning, and we're still going to, do a little, everyone says, what's the news? We're still going to sing the calendar song, or that's what my kid's doing because he's in kindergarten, but whatever the 12th grade version of that is, right? We're still going to have homeroom. We're still going to have whatever, right? I think, maintaining and predicting what the routine and ritual will be for the regular school day, predicting for kids what the routine and ritual will be for the home from school days when it's learning from home again.
You've used this word a couple of times, routine, and the importance of routine. I mean, this year in schools across the country, the entire school routine was destroyed. It was absolutely disrupted, and everyone had to kind of shift, and every school shifted in different ways, and then frequently had to shift again in response to things like digital divide, issues of equity that came up, and needing to respond to those. Looking into the fall, where we may be in person, but we also will absolutely need to be prepared to be online again in the possibility of an outbreak in a specific community. When you mention this word routine, like what's the importance of that concept for children's well-being and for teachers' well-being for that matter?
There's a number of things. I mean, one is that routine allows us to do this new word that's kind of gotten to be a buzzword recently, co-regulate. When we're all doing the same thing at around the same time, our bodies and our minds and our physiology are synchronized with each other. So that's important. in terms of learning and in terms of feeling a sense of community in general. Secondly, having ritual and routine it creates a sense of safety for kids and adults to feel like I don't know what's going to happen next week, but I know what's going to happen today. I can look forward to that this is what's going to be on the lunch menu, to still do announcements like that, right? These kinds of things are helpful because they also break up the day. And again, that lack of control, that feeling helplessness. Now it's randomly lunch. Now it's randomly math period. Now it's randomly we're doing music. Why? I don't know why, but we are, right? That doesn't feel good for anybody. It doesn't feel contained and safe and predictable. Kids don't feel safe. They're a little bit more psychophysiologically aroused, right? With their vagal system, or they're in the red zone, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use, or they're a little bit more in hypervigilance, right? I mean, and so again, when it's predictable, everyone can settle because I know that after math, we do music, and I know that after music, we have lunch. And I know after lunch, I get to see my friends. And I know after I get to see my friends, I'm back doing drop everything and read, or, who knows what. But this really helps everyone feel safe. It also just saves energy. Like, it is a nightmare to try to plan a different day every day, right? This is why we create routines as adults, right? I don't have to think, what should I do? Should I have my breakfast first, or should I take my shower first? It's like, no, like autopilot is really useful sometimes, right? It saves us a lot of prefrontal energy, which we actually need for learning and focus and for self and emotional regulation. So for all of these reasons, this is helpful. But I think most importantly, when it comes to schools, it gives kids a sense of safety, and that helps them to be able to learn that much more effectively when we have routines. And every ritual that we do, whether it's like that synchronizes everybody's body, or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, or all singing the school song together in the morning, or all listening to morning announcements, or all doing mindfulness, right? It synchronizes everybody in a way that helps us feel connected. And that, again, community is going to be so important in moving us through this crisis. So I'm a big believer in rituals and routines, and they also help us mark time. So I also believe, having rituals, what's the regular school day ritual going to be in routines? What is the, school from home or hybrid model going to be? And also that those are different than weekends. And I really, like, I know, there's a lot of kind of arguing online about sort of like whether you should get dressed for work or not. Like, all I know is it really helps me to get dressed for work and to put my shoes on and to comb my hair sometimes and like put on a shirt, and wear pants. Like, it really makes a difference for me. And again, I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that, again, it gets us psychologically prepared in some ways. Schools that are having kids show up for homeroom, even if it's nothing going on in homeroom, at 8:00 with, their clothes on, fully dressed. I do think that those kids are going to be better off in the long run. Again, I'm not saying that's an easy battle for parents or for schools, but I think holding that space and holding those expectations, I think can be really helpful. And I feel like I'm treading on dangerous ground here. This has gotten some people have gotten really emotional about this one, but I do feel like, again, just making things as predictable as possible is what's underneath all of that. It's not about like discipline or something like that. It's about maintaining a sense of normalcy and predictability is what's underneath that. So whatever that looks like for you. For me, it is putting on pants and putting on a shirt and putting on shoes.
What?
To show up and go on Zoom.
And we are always holding balances in education, right? Every choice that we make impacts myriad numbers of people and in ways we can't predict, and we're always kind of making our best guess effort, right? And so, yes, there is another side of this, which is, students can't always be available, and there may not be enough internet in the home for 4 students to be online at the same time. And so it may not be possible for everybody to have the exact same routine in the same ways, and we need to be flexible so we're not disadvantaging those students. And that is an important counterpoint, right? But there we are between those two counterpoints of we should be establishing routines to the best of our ability, and we need to acknowledge the limitations of that and be as flexible as possible for students who can't participate in those routines. But we have to hold.
How do we get
both.
bigger and support parents in their ability to do that, right?
Yes.
Like, how can we help parents to create routines, make sure that the kids are eating 3 meals a day, whether it's kids that get school lunch and school breakfast and they're picking it up, or we're delivering it as educators, or whether it's kids whose parents are still working 60 hours a week, in certain, suburban districts or something, who don't even know how to cook lunch. And the kids are like eating pretzels for lunch. I mean, this is happening like everywhere, but how do we as a community have these conversations about supporting our kids in their education in a way that's not shaming, in a way that's empowering for parents, in a way that's going to be ultimately most supportive and helpful for the kids? And again, it can be an opportunity to shame and divide, and why are you telling me this? Or it can be an opportunity to think, how can we come together as a community to think about, okay, school is canceled. Like, how can we all like get lunches to the kids? How can parents all pool resources who are working from home all of a sudden and can barely have time to feed their kids, even in sort of like quote unquote high functioning families, right? Like that we're all, again, maybe this can be a really cool community effort somehow and doesn't become more shaming and more divisive, creating more inequity or more like emotional, don't tell me what to do stuff. And I think that's going to be really tricky, but I think maybe, hopefully, I hope can present an opportunity to build more of that.
Yeah, and along those lines, something I would like to see more of across the board is communication with communities as communities.
Yeah.
So that we come up with localized community responses, because different communities have different realities there that they're working with, and leadership sometimes can get the message, like it's their job to come up with the answer and predict. And I think it really has to be their job to create the opportunities for the community to talk and come to communal decisions, so that we hear those different voices within a community, because there are needs and there are concerns that we may not have even thought of. And so how are we tapping into what our students think, what our teachers think, and what our community members think in responsible ways? I mean, that is a challenging undertaking in and of itself.
Right.
But if we're not doing that, all we're doing is guessing.
Right. Absolutely.
So moving from that impossible task to the people who are in that impossible task.
Impossible one.
Yeah. Yeah. Our educators are going to be in that role. They're in that role now, in an online capacity, and we're doing the best that we can in this year. And into the fall, I think we're only going to be upping the stakes in terms of what that job is going to entail.
Yeah.
And I know, as a teacher, when I entered the classroom, I was handed two tools to support me as an individual. One was a bottle of wine, and the second was a cup of coffee. And those were the tools I was given to kind of handle the stress of being a teacher. And it seems like we're going to have to be a bit more intentional to take care of ourselves and to take care of our teachers going forward. And so I thought maybe we could move in that direction, because I know that that's a passion and an interest of yours as well.
Big time. And again, I think, like what I want to offer, everybody, and, just to kind of put it out there is, like, take what you like and leave the rest. Like, I'm just spitballing what works for me, what I've seen work for some folks around me, and everyone's community is so different too, and I think, and teachers are so squeezed, and teachers with their own kids are also so squeezed. And I was a teacher for a couple of years, a special education teacher, and it was long after that I had kids, and my work is now very flexible, and I get it how hard it is for educators. So I just want to start by putting that out there. But I do think that, I'm finding a way, the classic, almost cliche metaphor of like, put on your own oxygen mask first, and then the people next to you. And I think one of the things that's hard as educators or therapists or people that care is like, how do we be people that care but not fall into that kind of like caregivering kind of role in a sort of like unhealthy way? Like, I think that can be really hard because we care a lot. So how do we kind of turn that back on ourselves and put that care back on ourselves? It's not our first instinct if we went into this work. It's probably really not. But I think just trying to remind each other of that importance of what is self-care, what is real self-care. When I was a teacher, I remember like we had some kind of BS-y self-care training, and then everyone was at the bar afterwards and was like, yeah, I got like 12 ounces of self-care right here. Or some of us, it's our pint of ice cream of self-care. But like, what's really the difference between self-care and self-indulgence? And it's so hard to find that right now, to figure out how to care for ourselves when we're so busy, when we're so scared, when there's so many new pressures being put on us, when maybe we're caring for our own kids, or we're worried about our own sick or aging parents, or just other things going on in our lives. it's hard. It's a hard sell. I get it. Um, at the same time, it's finding little ways to support each other. I think staff meetings are one of the reasons I stopped working in schools. I'll be honest with you, because they can be just such a source of negativity. And you don't have to be Pollyanna just to be like, let's talk about some of what's working, not just what's not working. Let's take some time to, just as we do positive behavioral support for the kids, let's have a parallel process around that. And let's, take some time for teachers and educators to thank each other. I want to thank that social worker who reached out to that kid who I was worried about. I want to thank this other teacher and recognize what they're doing, that they lent me their curriculum when I was up with my newborn baby last night. And I want to recognize that teacher with a newborn baby who's working so hard and is having trouble getting their curriculum done. I think really honoring each other's strengths right now is going to be so important. Focusing on the positive, because it can be so easy when we're stressed to fall into the negative. Talking to each other about what's working in their classrooms, online and off, as well as what's not working, because we have more to learn from what's working than what's not working. Talking about what are the things we are looking forward to, remembering that this will end. Oh my gosh, I forget that every day. And I think I'm trying to have that conversation. What are you going to do when this is over? What vacation or staycation are you going to take, right? Focusing on the positive things, what are you cooking? What new recipes are you trying out, right? What cool things are you doing with the kids online, right? I think, remembering to have these conversations that focus on the positive. It's not pretending that negative isn't there. It's not a spiritual bypass. It's just remembering that there is positive here too. There's growth happening here too for all of us. I think that's also really important. And I think to think about what are the ways we can work together. New alliances are forming in school districts where I'm consulting, but also new divisions are happening. There are new fault lines between those who have kids and those who don't have kids, those who are young and, those who are vulnerable. And I think, that's unfortunate, but finding ways to build more bridges rather than more divisions. And I think good leadership can go a long way toward that in particular. And again, those common goals of what are we all working toward. And I try to ask myself, I have a little mantra I ask myself, which is not, what do I want to have done by the end of this? How do I want to have spent this time? I'm not going to learn 5 new languages. I'm not going to read War and Peace. It's not going to happen for me. But who do I want to be? Who do I want to become by the end of this? Do I want to be the guy that took the last roll of toilet paper? Or do I want to be the guy that checked in with my neighbors who needs toilet paper and going to the store? Right. And I think for all of us to be asking ourselves that, because stress makes us more selfish. Is one of the things that stress can do, but it can also make us more community minded. And so trying to think about that, how can I be of service? How can I help others during this time and support those who need support?
And if I can, this is a bit of a stretch of a connection, but what it makes me think about, so before this whole crisis happened, I took a course through Penn State on online instruction and how to be a good online teacher. It really was. I'm glad I had it. And one of the concepts that really stood with me in that course was this idea of presence and teacher presence. And the teacher presence is something we can take for granted in in-person instruction, because we're there and they physically see us and we are physically present. And so a lot of the connection gets formed without effort. It just happens as a result of being in the room and sharing the space. But when you move to an online instruction, students don't feel that presence unless you're intentional about developing that presence. And for me, that idea of oh yeah, as the context shifts, intentionality becomes important in different ways. And right now, what I'm hearing in a lot of what you're saying is this idea of bringing intentionality to the way that we're relating to the experience and the way we are relating to each other in this time, because we know that we're stressed and we know that stress causes reactions in the brain, reactions in the body that drive us in directions that might not be so skillful. And so kind of counteracting that with intentional practices, such as acknowledging people who have helped you and saying thank you at the beginning of a faculty meeting, or doing some sort of practices that move in that direction, can be really helpful. They've always been helpful, but maybe are more critical now to
Mhm.
counteract that lack of physical connection that's missing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think our presence also, that we continue to hold that space. I mean, I think, it breaks my heart hearing from teachers. I did all this work. I made this music class, for the district, and like 3 kids showed up,
Mm,
and like, oh my God, like, I mean, I feel like I'm like almost like tearing up just like hearing some of these stories. But like, thank you so much for doing that, because everyone got that email and everyone knew that there was a teacher who cared, and everyone hopefully knew how much work you put into that, and that you're still holding that space. And it was so meaningful for those 3 kids that showed up. But it is also really meaningful to know those kids that don't have a lot of strong connections and attachments, to know that there are teachers out there, educators out there, holding that space for gym when no one shows up, for, extracurriculars when no one shows up, right? Like, for kids to know that, for families to know that you're still being that one adult that's helping that kid overcome those adverse childhood events, whether they can meet you, whether they do meet you, whether they can meet you, right, in that online space or not. You're still doing so much by holding that space. And I just really appreciate that. And it's also been interesting in my household. My wife was like, I don't know if Leo should go to music. He's kind of screened out for the day. And I was like, that teacher put a lot of work into that. Like, we're going to that music class, but not everyone knows that. But I do want you to know, when you're holding that space and it feels like people aren't showing up, teaching is always a thankless job. So I thank you for holding that space. And I want you to know that people know how much work that is and how discouraging it can feel. But thank you for holding that space. It's
yeah,
doing
but
something.
you're touching upon, in our own household, my wife's an English teacher. She's had that experience, like where the one kid or the 2 kids shows up, and there's a grieving that occurs with that. So I think you're really touching upon something that's a sensitive space right now for teachers, and valuing that is, I agree. Couldn't agree
Right.
more.
And then it becomes that easy for teachers to be like, oh, but so-and-so got 9 kids showing up and I only got 2 kids. And it's like, oh my gosh, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. Like, just like, please, oh my gosh, you're doing awesome. Like, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And something else that I've heard you talk about that I think is really valuable at this time is the intentionality around gratitude.
Mm, mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it, briefly in kind of thanking teachers who have helped you, but why? I mean, maybe it's obvious, but why gratitude? Why is that significant?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, for one thing, and because as I just said, like, there's so many thankless jobs, including educators. Sometimes we need to thank ourselves, um, and thank the world, even if no one's thanking us. So thanking each other is important. Act of gratitude, whether it's thanking your in-laws for babysitting, or, well, you could do this, or, thanking your partner for covering for you, or thanking, your kids for showing up, or thanking, just, your colleagues, or thanking the world. But I think what gratitude allows us to do, I think it can get a lot of heat for being like a spiritual bypass and Pollyanna, like looking at the world with rose-colored glasses when the world is falling apart. And like, I get that. But I think also what it does is the negativity bias, which is wired into us as humans, means that we take in the negative a lot more than we take in the positive. And we need actually to spend time taking in the positive, not just for our mental health, but actually for our clear seeing, to be able to see, oh, there are some good things happening. Hey, 2 kids showed up. Like, that's awesome. Last week, no kids showed up, right? Like, that kind of thing. And I think learning from those successes, and appreciating what's beautiful, appreciating what is interesting, about this time. Gratitude makes us more creative, more healthy. I think it'll actually help us to, if we can practice gratitude, to come up with better solutions to how we manage this crisis, rather than just trying to throw the same old, tired ideas at it, or fall into conflict and negativity even more, which doesn't help. Gratitude actually makes us more optimistic, and optimism makes us more creative. And what we need right now is a lot of creativity to figure out
Mm.
how to get us through this. And it helps us to listen to other people. So I think it's really important to appreciate what we do have, and appreciate also what other people, have had to go through in the past, our ancestors or other different communities in the world go through regularly in terms of deprivation, that are far more challenging than maybe what we have to face in terms of the sacrifices we're making. So it gives us a lot of perspective, helps our kids get some perspective on all of this too, which I think can be really important in terms of writing this history going forward. Yeah, in terms of lessons learned.
And I always like to end these interviews with two key questions. And the first is, what are the intentions that are driving your work right now? What are the goals that you have, or the motivating forces that are driving what you're doing these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a test, in a sense. I mean, I don't know if that language is quite right. I do think like there's this exercise in some spiritual traditions of, like if you were dead and looking back at your life, what would you want your life to have been? And I think that's a little dark. Hopefully I'm not going to die right in during this. But I think if I look back at the other side of like the day there's a vaccine, or the day that this, kind of shifts and ends, how do I want to look back at this time? And again, I think that question I sort of raised earlier of not what will I have wanted to have done, right, in selfish ways or accomplished, but like who will I want to have been, right? Like how will, I was saying to my wife, like this is unforgettable for our kids. And we're like, this is unforgettable for everybody in the world. No one's going to forget this in the world, right? Amazing. That connects us, right? So how do I want to remember it? And how do I want to be remembered? How do I want my son to remember this time? How do I want my patients and clients to remember this time? How do I want to be remembered during this time? And how do I want to remember myself during this time, right? And that really quickly suddenly brings my values into focus. Okay, kindness, generosity, gratitude, being of service. And what am I doing today that's living with those, in alignment with those values? Well, I'm having this great conversation with you, right? I'm talking to a friend in a little bit to do a free talk for parents somewhere else. And I'm doing some work for myself because I need to earn money and pay, right, my mortgage, right? But it's finding that balance. I'm going to be present as possible for my kids tonight, right? And so I'm pretty good with my values today, right? And so that to me is the question and what's driving me.
And what are the benefits in your life? What are the things that refill your cup these days?
I think honestly, Kevin, like conversations like this, like the one that we had last week, and we've got to go in a minute, but I hope we can continue talking again in a few weeks or something. But it's conversations like this. It's seeing like the good that people are doing and putting out there. It's seeing, teachers get creative, like, and suddenly figure out how to make the world work in a different way. It's seeing the acts of kindness. It's seeing the helpers who are out there. That really is what keeps me going to keep looking for that, and just trying to slow down and let, in a normal year, I was supposed to go to like 12 countries this year and travel and like all this stuff. And it's like, I'm not doing much travel this year, but man, I'm getting to know my own neighborhood in a deeply intimate way. I know, right? Like that flower on that tree out there is going to blossom in about 2 days, Scott. And I know my neighbors really well. We all had a social distancing barbecue last night on the street. Everyone we had a block party. Everyone like put their chairs out in front of their house, and we stayed at a safe distance and waved to each other. And I really got to know my neighbors. I wouldn't have done that if I was going to work every day or, traveling the way I usually travel. Like these are beautiful, beautiful things. And so that's keeping me going. Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more on the connecting and talking. It's just, I don't know. It's energetic. It's awesome to have good conversations like this with folks who are doing such important work and have thought about this and are trying to engage with this in a way that helps us grow from this traumatic experience that we're all sharing in. So thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it, your time. And I hope we continue the conversation too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Take care. And thank you to all the educators out there listening. And I hope I offered something helpful. Yeah. Stay in touch.
Thank you for joining us at Educators Respond.